Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time, we're taking a look at the 2019 State of the World's Indigenous Peoples Report.
A fascinating report, really.
It is.
Gives us a window into a world where, imagine, your deepest connection to the land is threatened,
Yeah.
your culture misunderstood,
Right.
and your very survival at stake. It's the reality for many indigenous peoples across the globe.
And there are a lot of them.
There are a lot. Did you know
Yeah.
there are
I didn't know the exact number.
over 5,000 distinct indigenous peoples across the globe speaking over 4,000 languages?
Yeah, that's just incredible diversity.
It is incredible diversity, and these communities, they're not just, holding on to the past.
Oh, so they're not just clinging to survival.
No, they are actively managing at least 24%
Wow.
of global carbon stored above ground in tropical forests.
24%, that's a massive contribution.
It is.
It really makes you realize how vital they are to the health of our planet.
Absolutely. These are guardians of nature, often using practices that have sustained them for millennia.
And I bet a lot of those practices are at odds with modern development.
Often, yeah. And this report takes us on a journey across continents, highlighting how indigenous communities are grappling with these modern challenges.
Okay, so let's get started with the journey. Where are we headed first?
Let's start in Asia.
Okay, what's happening in Asia in 2019?
Well, in Laos, there's this new forest strategy. And it's causing concern because it basically categorizes traditional shifting cultivation lands as degraded, which could then clear the way for industrial use.
Wait, so land that's been sustainably managed for generations is suddenly considered damaged?
That's right.
That doesn't seem quite right.
It certainly raises questions about whose interests are being prioritized here.
Yeah, it really does.
And this tension between traditional land use and modern development that we see in Laos, that's not unique.
Where else are we seeing that?
We see it in India, for example.
Okay.
Millions of claims under the Forest Rights Act are being rejected,
Wow.
leaving tribal communities at risk of eviction.
It seems like this clash is a recurring theme.
It is a recurring theme, even in Indonesia,
Okay.
where the Constitutional Court affirmed indigenous land rights back in 2013.
Right.
The government is now,
Oh, wow.
they're arguing against granting specific rights to indigenous peoples.
Even though the court already decided that?
Yeah.
It sounds like the fight for land rights is a common thread throughout Asia.
It is, very much so.
And this clash between tradition and development, are we seeing similar things in other parts of the world?
Absolutely. In Africa, we see a mix of challenges related to land rights, cultural identity, and even physical safety.
Give me an example.
Take Algeria,
Okay.
the Amazigh people. They're facing the marginalization of their identity
Right.
with restrictions on their language and culture.
So even though Tamazight was recognized as an official language back in 2016,
Yes,
they're still struggling for true cultural recognition.
they are.
And in Cameroon,
Okay.
what's happening there?
Well, the Momboro community are grappling with violence and displacement amidst this ongoing conflict.
That's heartbreaking.
It's a tragic reality for many indigenous communities that are caught in the crossfire.
Absolutely. Are there other communities facing similar threats to their safety and their way of life?
There are. In Tanzania,
Okay.
the government's plan to divide the Ngorongoro conservation area is posing a threat
Right.
to the Maasai people
Yeah.
and their pastoralist way of life.
So we're seeing cultural suppression, land grabs, even violence.
Mm-hmm.
Is this repeated in the Americas?
Sadly, yes.
Okay.
In Brazil, deforestation and fires in the Amazon during Bolsonaro's presidency, that's raising alarms globally.
And those directly impacting indigenous communities.
Directly, yeah.
It's hard to even imagine the devastation.
It is?
Are there any signs of positive change?
There are. In Chile,
Okay.
indigenous women are leading social protests,
Oh,
highlighting how damaging extractivist policies are.
that's inspiring. It's so important for them to have that platform.
It is, yeah.
To speak out,
Yeah?
are there any instances where these efforts have resulted in concrete victories?
There are. In Ecuador,
Okay.
the Waorani people
Yeah.
won a landmark legal battle protecting their territory from oil extraction.
That's amazing.
It is.
It's a reminder that even against these powerful interests,
Mm-hmm.
these communities can achieve significant victories
Yes.
for their land and for their future.
It speaks to the importance of their self-determination,
Right.
their right to have control over their traditional territories
Yeah.
and make decisions about their own future.
That seems to be a recurring theme,
It is.
this desire for autonomy and control.
It is, very much so. And it's intertwined with another global challenge, climate change.
Absolutely.
The irony is that indigenous communities are often blamed for deforestation,
Right.
when in reality, they are actually key to conservation efforts.
Yeah, you're right. It's like blaming the victims instead of acknowledging their vital role in protecting the planet.
Yeah.
What stands out to you from all of this?
The resilience of these communities,
Yeah.
despite facing these immense challenges,
Mm-mm.
they are fighting for their rights, protecting their lands, and preserving their cultures.
Their determination is just incredibly inspiring.
It really is. And that resilience is evident across the globe.
So where are we headed next on our journey?
Let's shift our focus back over to Africa.
Okay.
Remember we were talking about the Maasai people in Tanzania?
Yeah, facing threats to their way of life.
Exactly. Well, over in Kenya, indigenous women are playing a really critical role
Okay.
in holding their communities together
That's so.
and ensuring sustainable resource use.
Interesting.
They are, in essence, the last bastion of social accountability.
That's powerful.
It is.
They're like the backbone of their communities,
Mhm.
yet they face marginalization even within those communities.
Right.
It's a reminder that these issues are intersectional.
They are.
We need to think about
Mhm.
the challenges faced by Indigenous women, youth, other groups within these broader communities.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing the diversity of experiences
Right.
within these communities.
Yeah.
Now, over in Eritrea, the Afar, Kunama, Saho, and Nara peoples
Right.
who have lived on their land for centuries,
Right.
they're facing marginalization and persecution.
What kinds?
And their traditional practices, which are often in tune with the environment,
Right.
are disregarded or criminalized.
So it's like we keep coming back to this tension
We do.
between traditional practices and modern development.
Mhm. And it's a tension that needs careful navigation.
Yeah. How do we make sure these two things can coexist?
Well, that's a big question. And, even initiatives like REDD+,
Okay.
which aim to reduce emissions from deforestation,
Right.
they can have unintended consequences
Well, how so?
if they don't fully respect indigenous people's rights.
Okay, give me an example.
Okay, in Gabon,
Okay.
the government's considering recognizing traditional land rights
Okay.
in its REDD+ strategy.
Okay.
But there are also plans for large-scale agroforestry and renewable energy projects.
And historically, those haven't really worked out so well.
And historically, yeah, these types of projects have often ended up compromising the interests of indigenous communities.
So it's like a delicate balance.
Yeah, it's a delicate balance.
How do we find ways to address climate change and promote development without repeating the mistakes of the past?
That's the challenge, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's why it's so crucial to have indigenous peoples at the forefront of these discussions.
Your voices need to be heard.
Absolutely.
Speaking of progress, are there any countries in Africa taking positive steps toward recognizing indigenous rights?
There are.
Okay, where?
Namibia,
Okay.
for instance, has been working on a white paper on the rights of indigenous peoples for years now.
Okay.
And it's actually awaiting parliamentary approval.
That's encouraging. It shows that some governments are taking concrete steps
Yeah,
toward codifying these rights.
absolutely. But challenges still exist.
Right, of course.
But it's a step in the right direction.
Yeah. Are there any examples of policies being implemented to address the needs of indigenous communities?
Yes, in Niger,
Okay.
they're developing a new rural land policy specifically designed to protect pastoralist livelihoods.
Interesting.
And it includes these provisions for reviewing land governance
Okay.
and increasing the budget for rural land issues.
It sounds like they're taking a collaborative approach.
Exactly. Collaboration is key.
Okay, now what about Tunisia?
In Tunisia,
Yeah.
we see the Amazigh people
Right.
striving for recognition,
Mm-hmm.
even though they have a long history in the region.
Yeah.
Their language and culture aren't officially recognized by the state.
So it's like another example of this struggle for cultural survival.
Unfortunately, yes.
Yeah.
And this lack of recognition
Yeah.
can have very real-world consequences.
Mm.
If you look at Uganda,
Okay.
the Batwa people are constantly searching for resources
Oi.
because they're landless,
Okay.
and this makes them extremely vulnerable to the impacts of climate change,
Right.
especially extreme weather events.
It's a harsh reality.
It is.
Climate change disproportionately affects communities that are already struggling.
Yeah.
Okay, what about Zimbabwe? Are there any positive developments there?
Well, in Zimbabwe, the Trushwasen community,
Okay.
they're actively pushing for greater recognition
Of what?
of their traditional leaders and customs.
Okay.
But they're facing challenges
Like what?
related to identity documents,
Okay.
and access to basic services.
It highlights the importance of governments not just recognizing indigenous peoples in principle,
Right.
but actually implementing policies that address their needs
Mm.
and ensure that they have full participation in society.
Yeah,
True recognition requires action.
absolutely.
Okay, so let's move over to Asia,
Okay.
where we see indigenous peoples dealing with complex issues related to development, cultural preservation, and political representation.
Hmm.
What's happening in Asia?
Well, in Bangladesh, the government is actually trying to restrict the use of the term Adivasi,
Okay.
which is commonly used to refer to indigenous peoples.
Really?
This has caused a lot of pushback
Yeah, I bet.
from activists
Right.
who see it as an attempt to erase their identity.
It's a powerful example of how language can be used as a tool of oppression
Mm-hmm.
to control how people are identified.
Absolutely. Words have power.
Yeah, they do.
Now, looking at Cambodia,
Okay.
there's a long-standing land dispute
With who?
involving the HAGL company.
Okay, and what's happening there?
While the government did return some community land,
Okay.
the creation of national parks in the Sanjianguan region is raising concerns about the displacement of Tibetan nomads
Right.
and the impact on their traditional way of life.
So it's that tension, again,
Mhm.
between conservation and indigenous rights.
Yes, we see this in many places.
Yeah, are there any examples of this being put into practice?
Well, there are some promising initiatives
Like what?
in Nepal.
Okay.
The government's attempt to introduce the Guthi Bill,
What would that have done?
which would have given the state control over traditional land management systems,
Oh, wow.
was met with strong resistance
Yeah, that.
from the Nuwa indigenous peoples
Right?
because they saw it as a threat to their cultural heritage.
It's a powerful example of indigenous peoples actively defending their rights and their cultures.
Absolutely, and this act of resistance is crucial.
Mm-hmm.
Now turning to India,
Okay.
forest-dwelling tribal communities,
Mm-hmm.
they're facing really serious challenges
Like what?
related to land rights and development projects.
Right.
Millions of claims under the Forest Rights Act
Mm-hmm.
have been rejected.
It's frustrating that these legal frameworks are often not enough.
It is, and it highlights the need for genuine commitment to implementation
Right.
and a shift in power dynamics.
It's not just about laws on paper.
Exactly.
It's about making sure those laws are upheld
Mhm.
and enforced in a way that respects indigenous people's rights.
Absolutely.
Are there other instances in India where these power dynamics are creating problems?
Yes. In Nagaland,
Okay.
the extension of the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, or AFSPA,
Right.
continues to be a major concern.
Why is that?
Well, it raises serious questions about human rights violations
Mm-hmm.
and the militarization of indigenous territories.
Yeah, it's a reminder that security concerns can be used to justify actions that infringe upon indigenous people's rights.
Absolutely. We need to be wary of that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, looking at Indonesia, a
Mhm.
country with a very diverse indigenous population,
Yeah.
we see that despite the constitutional recognition of indigenous people's rights, government is reluctant to grant specific rights.
Right, so it's like this gap, again, between recognition in principle and meaningful action.
It is. Recognizing indigenous peoples is not a one-time event.
Right.
It's an ongoing process.
That requires constant effort.
Yes.
And it also means addressing discrimination at all levels of society.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, in West Papua,
Yeah.
the struggle for independence continues.
Right.
And indigenous Papuans face this ongoing conflict and human rights violations.
Absolutely. Their situation emphasizes the importance of self-determination,
Right.
the right of indigenous peoples to freely determine their own political status and pursue their economic, social, and cultural development.
It's about respecting their right to choose their own path.
Mm-hmm.
What about Japan? How are indigenous rights being addressed there?
Well, in Japan, the Ainu people
Okay.
have been seeking greater recognition
Of what?
of their indigenous identity and rights. A new law was passed in 2019 recognizing them as indigenous.
Okay, so that's good.
But there are concerns about its effectiveness
In terms of what?
in addressing their historical grievances
Okay.
and promoting their cultural revitalization.
And it's like a step in the right direction, but it's important to see whether those words translate into real change.
Exactly. Recognition without action is hollow.
Mm-hmm. It's about addressing systemic discrimination and creating a truly just and equitable society.
Absolutely.
Okay, what about Laos?
Yeah.
We talked about their forest strategy earlier.
Mhm.
What other challenges are indigenous communities facing there?
Well, economic development in Laos is having really complex impacts on indigenous communities.
Okay, how so?
That new forest strategy that we discussed
Right.
is particularly concerning as it could potentially lead to the loss of traditional lands.
Right. The reclassification of shifting cultivation lands as degraded
Hmm.
could open them up for industrial use.
Interesting.
It's
Yeah.
like we're seeing this pattern.
Yeah.
Development projects often coming at a cost to indigenous communities.
Right. It's crucial to consider the potential consequences
Mm-hmm.
of these projects
Yeah.
and ensure that indigenous peoples have a say in the decisions that affect their lives and lands
Absolutely. Their voices need to be part of the conversation
from the very beginning.
from the very beginning. Okay, what about Myanmar?
The situation in Myanmar is, unfortunately, quite precarious.
Okay.
With the ongoing conflict and displacement,
Right.
indigenous communities are particularly vulnerable.
How so?
Their lands are often targeted for resource extraction,
Mm-hmm.
and they face increased risks of human rights abuses.
It's a stark reminder that conflict and instability often hit indigenous communities the hardest,
They do.
exacerbating existing inequalities.
Absolutely. And it emphasizes this urgent need for peace-building efforts.
That prioritize human rights and the protection of indigenous lands and cultures.
We can't forget about these communities caught in the crossfire.
Absolutely. Their needs and rights must be central to any peace-building efforts.
Yeah.
What about the Philippines? Are there any specific development projects there that are raising concerns?
Yes. The proposed South Pulangi hydroelectric power plant project
Okay.
is a major concern.
Why is that?
Large-scale infrastructure projects like this
Mm-hmm.
often pose a serious threat to indigenous lands and livelihoods.
It's a reminder that we need to find a balance between economic development and environmental and social sustainability.
We do.
Development shouldn't come at the expense of indigenous people's rights.
I completely agree. Free, prior, and informed consent from indigenous communities is absolutely crucial.
Before any projects that could impact their lands and resources are approved.
Absolutely.
That's a fundamental principle of indigenous rights.
That is.
They have the right to say no
Mm,
to projects that could harm their communities and territory.
precisely. And it's a principle that needs to be upheld.
Okay, now let's look at Taiwan.
In Taiwan,
Yeah.
the Pingpu indigenous peoples are still fighting for full recognition.
What does that mean?
Despite their long history and cultural contributions,
Yeah.
they face ongoing challenges
Like what?
related to identity, land rights, and political representation.
It's a reminder that recognition isn't just about acknowledging the past. It's about creating a more just and equitable society.
In the present.
In the present, yeah. And it requires addressing systemic discrimination and ensuring that all indigenous peoples have equal rights and opportunities.
Absolutely.
Okay, what about Thailand? Are there any positive developments there regarding indigenous peoples' participation in the political process?
In Thailand, we see indigenous communities actively engaging
Oh, that's good.
in the political process.
Okay.
There have been indigenous leaders elected to parliament.
That's a positive step.
It is a positive step, however.
Okay.
Securing land rights and implementing policies that protect their cultural heritage and traditional livelihoods
Mm-hmm.
remain ongoing challenges. It's a great example of indigenous peoples using their voices.
And a political power to advocate for their rights and their interests.
It is. It highlights how important it is for indigenous peoples to have a seat at the table
Right.
and participate in decision-making processes that affect their lives.
Their voices and perspectives are invaluable.
Absolutely.
Okay, now let's turn our attention over to Latin America,
Okay.
a region with a rich tapestry of indigenous cultures
Mm.
and a long history of struggles for rights and recognition.
It is.
What's happening in Argentina in 2019?
Well, indigenous communities in Argentina
Yeah.
are grappling with poverty, discrimination, and a lack of access to essential services.
And are there any specific examples that come to mind?
Yeah, the tragic deaths of witchy children
Oh, wow.
due to malnutrition and preventable diseases.
That's heartbreaking.
It is.
It underscores the urgent need for social justice policies that address the root causes of these inequalities.
It does. We need to move beyond just acknowledging the problem
Right.
and start implementing real solutions.
Okay, what about Bolivia? They've had some pretty significant political shifts in recent years.
Yeah, they have.
How has that impacted indigenous communities?
Bolivia's situation is complex.
Okay.
The resignation of Evo Morales,
Right.
the country's first indigenous president,
Yeah.
and the subsequent violence against indigenous protesters
Wow.
highlight this ongoing tension and complexity surrounding political representation and self-determination.
It's a reminder that progress isn't always linear.
It's not.
There can be setbacks and these ongoing struggles to protect hard-won rights and ensure that Indigenous voices are respected.
It underscores the importance of upholding the rights of all citizens, regardless of their ethnicity or their political views.
Democracy requires inclusivity
It does.
and respect for diverse perspectives.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's move on to Brazil.
Okay.
We talked about the Amazon earlier. Are there any other pressing issues facing Indigenous communities there?
The situation in Brazil is particularly concerning. Deforestation, fires, and development projects
Right.
are putting immense pressure on the Amazon rainforest, directly impacting the indigenous communities who have lived there for centuries.
Right.
And the policies of President Bolsonaro have further fueled these concerns.
How so?
There have been reports of weakening environmental protections and violations of indigenous peoples' rights.
It's alarming to think about the potential consequences for the Amazon,
It is.
which plays such a vital role in regulating the global climate.
Exactly. It's a global issue.
Yeah.
And we need international cooperation to protect this crucial ecosystem.
Now let's shift gears to Chile.
Okay.
They've been experiencing social unrest and calls for constitutional reform. How are Indigenous peoples involved in these movements?
Well, indigenous peoples in Chile are actually at the forefront of these protests,
Oh, wow.
demanding recognition of their rights, an end to these harmful extractivist policies, and greater control over their lands and resources.
It's inspiring to see them taking such an active role in shaping their country's future.
It is. It speaks to their determination and resilience in the face of ongoing challenges.
Yeah, it does. It's about moving beyond token representation towards genuine self-determination.
Exactly.
Now, turning to Colombia, a country emerging from this long and brutal armed conflict, we see that Indigenous peoples have been disproportionately affected by the violence.
They have.
In what ways?
They've faced displacement, forced recruitment, and attacks on their leaders and communities.
It's a tragic reminder of the human cost of conflict and how it can shatter lives and communities.
It is.
What's being done to address these issues and support the healing process
There's this growing recognition of the need for peace-building efforts.
that prioritize the rights and well-being of Indigenous peoples.
Absolutely, including their full participation in the processes of reconciliation and rebuilding.
It's crucial that they're not just included, but that they are leading these efforts.
They need to be leading.
Yeah.
Their knowledge and perspectives are essential to achieving lasting peace and justice.
Okay, shifting our focus now to Costa Rica,
Okay.
a country often lauded for its environmental policies and human rights record. Even there, Indigenous peoples face challenges?
They do.
What kinds?
They continue to face issues related to land rights, discrimination, and access to justice.
So it's a reminder that even in countries with strong human rights records, Indigenous peoples may still face systemic inequalities and barriers.
They do.
It underscores the importance of continued vigilance and holding governments accountable for upholding the rights of all citizens, including Indigenous peoples. There's always more work to be done.
You're absolutely right. No country is immune to these challenges.
Now, looking at Cuba, a country undergoing significant political and economic changes, Indigenous peoples are raising their voices, seeking greater recognition
Of what?
of their cultural identity and rights, as well as addressing historical grievances related to colonization and assimilation.
Yeah, it's a reminder that the struggle for Indigenous rights and recognition is a continuous process, even in contexts of political and social transformation.
Right.
And it highlights the need for inclusive and participatory approaches to development.
That ensure that Indigenous peoples have a voice in shaping their own futures.
Yeah, absolutely. Their perspectives and knowledge are invaluable assets in navigating these changes.
What about the Dominican Republic?
In the Dominican Republic,
Yeah.
Indigenous peoples are working really hard to reclaim their cultural heritage
Okay.
and address the legacy of colonialism.
And what challenges are they facing?
They face challenges related to discrimination, land rights, and the preservation of their languages and traditions.
It's a reminder of how deeply colonialism has impacted Indigenous communities and how its effects can reverberate for generations.
Yeah, it's not just about the past.
Right.
It's about how those past injustices continue to shape the present.
Exactly, and it underscores the importance of addressing these historical wrongs and creating opportunities for healing and reconciliation.
Absolutely.
Now let's turn to Ecuador.
Oh,
They've had some notable successes in protecting indigenous rights.
they have.
Yeah,
Ecuador is home to a diverse indigenous population
right.
and has a history of strong activism for land rights and self-determination.
Hmm.
The recent victory of the Waorani people,
Right.
who successfully protected their territory from oil extraction.
Yeah, that's an incredible victory.
It is. It's a testament to their resilience and the power of collective action.
Absolutely. What does it tell us about the legal frameworks in place?
Well, it demonstrates the importance of legal frameworks that uphold indigenous peoples' rights
To what?
to free, prior, and informed consent,
Mm-hmm.
as well as their land rights and cultural heritage.
These are not just abstract concepts.
They're not
They're tools for empowerment.
exactly.
Okay, what about French Guiana?
French Guiana, as an overseas territory of France,
Right.
presents these unique challenges
Okay.
for its indigenous peoples.
Ow.
They're striving for greater autonomy and control over their lands and resources.
Okay.
But they face obstacles
Like what?
related to mining, development projects,
Mm.
and this lack of recognition of their traditional governance systems.
So it's this complex situation, navigating self-determination within a colonial framework.
It is. It highlights the need to address the power imbalances inherent in these relationships
Mm-hmm.
and create pathways for indigenous peoples to exercise their self-determination in a meaningful way.
It sounds like there's a lot of work to be done in French Guiana
There is.
to make sure that indigenous voices are heard
Mhm.
and their rights are respected.
Absolutely. And it's a situation we see reflected in various forms across the globe.
Okay, let's move on to Guatemala.
Okay.
What challenges are indigenous communities facing there?
Guatemala has a long history of conflict and human rights violations.
Right.
And indigenous peoples continue to face significant challenges,
Like what?
including poverty, discrimination, and lack of access to justice.
It's a sad reality that these issues persist.
It is.
What steps are being taken to address these historical injustices and improve the lives of indigenous communities in Guatemala?
Well, there's a growing focus on transitional justice mechanisms
And what do those do?
that aim to address past wrongs and create avenues for healing and reconciliation.
It's so important to acknowledge and address the past in order to move forward in a just and equitable way.
It is. And it's a process that requires commitment and collaboration from all segments of society.
Now let's turn to Guyana.
Okay.
What are the key issues facing indigenous communities there?
Well, in Guyana, land rights are a major concern
Okay.
for indigenous communities. The government's efforts to address land titling
Right.
have been slow and criticized for not adequately incorporating indigenous perspectives and customary land tenure systems.
It highlights the importance of making sure that indigenous peoples have genuine control over their lands and resources.
Exactly. It's not just about legal ownership.
Right.
It's about recognizing and respecting indigenous people's right to manage their lands and resources in accordance with their own traditions and values.
What about Honduras? What are the pressing issues facing indigenous peoples there?
Honduras faces high levels of violence, poverty, and corruption,
Right.
making indigenous communities especially vulnerable.
In what ways?
They face displacement, attacks on their leaders, and even criminalization of their efforts to defend their lands and resources.
It's a reminder that these issues are interconnected. And indigenous peoples often face multiple and overlapping forms of discrimination and violence.
They do.
So we need to address these challenges in a holistic way.
We do.
Protecting human rights defenders, promoting sustainable development, and strengthening the rule of law.
Absolutely. It's about creating a just and equitable society for everyone.
Okay, now let's move on to Mexico, a country with a rich indigenous heritage, but also a long history of discrimination. What's happening there in 2019?
Well, indigenous peoples in Mexico are actively fighting for greater autonomy, recognition of their traditional governance systems, and the protection of their lands and cultures.
They're challenging the historical legacy of marginalization and demanding a more just and inclusive future.
They are, and it's a reminder that the struggle for indigenous rights and recognition is a global movement.
With communities all over the world standing up and demanding justice.
Absolutely.
What about Nicaragua? What's the situation like for indigenous communities there?
Unfortunately, Nicaragua is currently facing significant political turmoil and repression,
Okay.
and indigenous peoples have been targeted
By who?
by government forces and armed groups.
Oh, wow.
facing violence, displacement, and violations of their rights to land and self-determination.
That's awful.
It's a tragic situation.
It is. It's crucial that the international community pays attention to what's happening.
And exerts pressure to protect human rights and promote a peaceful resolution to the crisis.
Absolutely. We cannot allow these violations to go unchecked.
Now let's turn to Panama.
Okay.
What's the situation there regarding indigenous rights?
Well, Panama has a diverse indigenous population and a history of both recognizing and struggling to implement indigenous rights.
Okay.
While there are legal frameworks in place,
Right.
the challenge lies in ensuring that those rights are upheld on the ground.
And what challenges are they facing?
Indigenous communities still face significant obstacles
Like what?
in terms of land rights, resource management, and participation in decision-making processes.
So it's a reminder that legal frameworks alone are not enough.
They're not.
We need to address the power imbalances that prevent these rights from being fully realized.
Exactly. It requires a genuine commitment
To what?
to empowering indigenous communities and ensuring that their voices are heard and their rights are respected in practice.
Okay, let's move on to Paraguay.
What challenges are indigenous communities facing there?
In Paraguay,
Yeah.
indigenous communities are dealing with poverty, lack of access to basic services, and ongoing land rights issues.
Right.
The recent devastating floods have highlighted their vulnerability to climate change and the urgent need for adaptation and resilience strategies.
It's a reminder that climate change isn't just an environmental issue,
It's not.
but a social justice issue as well. The most marginalized communities, including indigenous peoples, often bear the brunt of its impacts.
They do.
So what can be done to address that?
We need climate justice solutions.
That prioritize the needs of indigenous communities
Absolutely.
and recognize their traditional knowledge and practices for adaptation and resilience.
They hold valuable insights into living sustainably with the land.
What about Peru? How are indigenous communities there responding to the challenges they face?
Peru is a country with a rich indigenous heritage, but also a complex history of exploitation and marginalization.
Right.
While there have been some positive steps,
Such as?
like the creation of the Indigenous Climate Platform,
Okay.
indigenous communities still grapple with challenges
Like what?
related to extractive industries, land rights, and environmental degradation.
So it sounds like a familiar story.
It is.
This struggle to balance economic development with the protection of indigenous rights and the environment.
And it emphasizes the need for greater accountability
For who?
from governments and corporations to ensure that development projects don't come at the expense of indigenous peoples.
What about Suriname? Are there any positive developments there in terms of indigenous rights?
Suriname is showing signs of progress.
Okay. In what ways?
They're intensifying their efforts to build capacity among indigenous leaders
Okay.
and have established projects to monitor the implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
That sounds promising.
It is.
What does it tell us?
These are positive steps towards ensuring that indigenous communities have the tools and resources they need.
To advocate for their rights and participate in decision-making processes.
Yeah.
Expert. To advocate for their rights and participate in decision-making processes.
It is. It highlights the importance of recognizing the expertise and leadership that indigenous communities bring to the table.
Okay, now let's move on to Uruguay.
Uruguay.
Yeah.
The indigenous population is relatively small,
Okay.
but they are actively working to revitalize their cultural heritage and secure their rights.
In what ways?
They're engaged in efforts to reclaim ancestral lands and promote the use of indigenous languages.
So it's a reminder that even in countries with smaller indigenous populations, the fight for recognition and self-determination continues.
It does. It demonstrates the power of cultural resilience and the importance of language, education, and community initiatives in strengthening indigenous identity
Right.
and passing on traditional knowledge
To future generations.
to future generations.
Okay, now let's turn to Venezuela, a country facing a severe political and economic crisis. How has this affected indigenous communities?
The crisis in Venezuela has had a devastating impact on all its citizens,
Right.
and indigenous peoples are no exception.
Are there any specific communities that have been particularly hard hit?
The Pimon indigenous community in particular
Okay.
has been targeted by government forces and armed groups,
Wow.
facing violence, displacement, and violations of their rights.
It's a tragic situation.
It is.
It highlights how political and economic instability can exacerbate existing vulnerabilities and put indigenous communities at even greater risk.
Absolutely. It underscores this urgent need for international humanitarian assistance and a peaceful resolution to the crisis that respects the rights and well-being of all Venezuelans,
Including indigenous peoples.
including indigenous peoples, yeah.
Okay, let's shift our focus now to the Oceania region.
Okay.
What are some of the key issues and developments happening there in relation to indigenous rights?
Well, in Australia, there's a significant movement towards establishing a First Nations voice to Parliament,
Okay, and what would that do?
which would be a representative body giving Indigenous Australians a say in policies that affect their lives.
So that's a major step towards recognizing their right to self-determination
It is.
and ensuring that their voices are heard in the political process.
It is. It's a major development.
It's great to see a government taking those concrete steps
Yeah.
towards greater inclusion.
It highlights the importance of listening to Indigenous peoples
Right.
and incorporating their perspectives into policy development.
Okay, now let's turn to New Zealand, a country that's often been praised for its progress in recognizing indigenous rights. What's the current situation there?
New Zealand has made significant strides in addressing historical injustices
Okay.
and recognizing Indigenous rights.
Right.
However,
There's always a however.
there are challenges that remain
Like what?
in areas like land ownership, resource management, and the equitable distribution of wealth and opportunities.
So the journey towards reconciliation is ongoing.
It is an ongoing process.
It's a reminder that even in countries that have made significant progress,
Mm-hmm.
there's always more work to be done to achieve true equality and justice for indigenous peoples.
You're absolutely right. It's a continuous process that requires ongoing effort and a willingness to address these systemic issues.
What about Papua New Guinea? What challenges are indigenous communities facing there?
Papua New Guinea has a diverse indigenous population
Right.
and a complex history of land rights issues and environmental challenges.
Okay.
The impacts of mining and logging operations continue to raise concerns about environmental degradation and the violation of indigenous peoples' rights to land and resources.
It's a reminder that we need to find ways to balance economic development with environmental protection
Yeah.
and respect for indigenous rights.
We need to find sustainable solutions that benefit everyone.
Exactly. And it highlights the need for stronger environmental regulations, free, prior, and informed consent from indigenous communities. Absolutely.
And accountability mechanisms.
To ensure that corporations operating in indigenous territories are held responsible for their actions.
Now let's shift our focus to the Arctic region.
Okay.
What are some of the unique challenges facing indigenous communities there?
Well, in the Arctic,
Yeah.
indigenous peoples are on the front lines of climate change.
Right?
They're witnessing firsthand the melting of sea ice, thawing permafrost, and changing weather patterns,
Mm-hmm.
which threaten their traditional hunting and fishing grounds,
Right.
infrastructure,
Yeah.
and their very way of life.
It's a stark reminder that climate change is not some distant threat.
It's not.
It is a present reality
A present reality
for many indigenous communities.
for many indigenous communities around the world.
Around the world. And it highlights the importance of indigenous knowledge and practices
Mm-hmm.
in understanding and responding to climate change.
Absolutely. Their traditional knowledge systems hold valuable insights into adapting to a changing environment. What about Canada? What are the key issues facing indigenous communities there?
Canada has a large indigenous population
Right.
and a complex history of relations with indigenous peoples.
Mm-hmm.
While the government has made commitments to address issues like reconciliation, land claims, and the implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples,
Right.
progress has been uneven.
Meaning?
Indigenous communities still face systemic discrimination and inequalities.
So it's a reminder that reconciliation is a long and complex process
It is.
that requires sustained effort, open dialogue, and a willingness to address historical injustices.
Absolutely. It's not a one-time fix. It's an ongoing journey towards a more just and equitable future for all Canadians.
What about Greenland? How are indigenous communities there asserting their rights and shaping their own futures?
Greenland, a self-governing territory within the Kingdom of Denmark,
Right.
with a majority Inuit population,
Yeah.
has been a leader in asserting indigenous rights and playing an active role in international Arctic affairs. They're facing challenges related to economic development,
Okay.
environmental protection, and preserving their language and culture in a rapidly changing world.
It's inspiring to see Indigenous communities taking a leading role in shaping their destinies and addressing the challenges they face,
It is.
both locally and globally.
It highlights the importance of international cooperation and solidarity in supporting Indigenous peoples' rights and aspirations.
Absolutely. Now let's turn our attention to the United States.
Okay.
What's the current state of Indigenous rights there?
The United States has a long and complicated history with its Indigenous population.
Yeah.
While there has been some progress in recent decades in recognizing tribal sovereignty and addressing historical injustices, Indigenous peoples in the U.S. continue to face systemic discrimination,
Right.
poverty, and challenges related to land rights, healthcare, and education.
It sounds like there's still a long way to go to achieve true equality and justice for Indigenous peoples in the United States.
There is the ongoing struggle for recognition, treaty rights, and environmental justice is a testament to the resilience and determination of Indigenous peoples.
Absolutely. And it's a reminder to us all that we have a responsibility to listen to their voices, learn from their experiences, and support their efforts to secure their rights and build a better future.
Their struggles are our struggles.
And we all have a role to play in creating a more just and equitable world.
Absolutely.
Okay, now let's shift our focus to Europe,
Okay.
a continent not often associated with Indigenous peoples.
That's right. But Europe is home to the Sami people,
Okay.
who have inhabited the northern regions of Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia for centuries.
And what challenges are they facing?
The Sami, like Indigenous communities in many other parts of the world, face challenges related to land rights, cultural preservation, and the impacts of development projects
On their traditional livelihoods.
on their traditional livelihoods, such as reindeer herding and fishing.
So it's a reminder that Indigenous peoples exist all over the world.
And their rights and concerns need to be addressed in all contexts.
Exactly. Indigenous rights are human rights.
And we need to work together to ensure that those rights are respected everywhere.
Absolutely.
Now, let's turn our attention to a region facing significant challenges. The Middle East.
Okay.
What's happening there in 2019?
In Israel,
Yeah.
the Bedouin Indigenous peoples continue to face displacement, discrimination,
Right.
and the demolition of their homes and communities by the Israeli government.
It's a stark reminder that the violation of Indigenous peoples' rights is a global issue,
It is.
and that we need to stand in solidarity with them in their struggles for justice and self-determination.
Absolutely. We need to amplify their voices
Right.
and hold those in power accountable for their actions. What about Russia? What challenges are Indigenous communities facing there?
Russia is a vast country with a diverse Indigenous population
Right.
facing a range of challenges,
Like what?
from the impacts of climate change and extractive industries to the erosion of cultural traditions and language loss.
Okay.
The situation in Siberia, for example, is particularly concerning.
Okay. What?
Wildfires and deforestation are threatening the lands and livelihoods of Indigenous peoples who depend on the forest for their survival.
It's a reminder that environmental issues are deeply intertwined with Indigenous rights. And we need to find sustainable solutions that respect both the environment and the cultural heritage of Indigenous communities.
Exactly. It highlights the important role that Indigenous peoples play in protecting the environment. Their traditional knowledge and practices are invaluable assets in our efforts to address climate change and conserve biodiversity.
It's about recognizing their expertise and empowering them to lead the way towards a more sustainable future.
Absolutely.
So as we've journeyed across the globe, we've seen this tapestry of challenges and triumphs. But one thing is clear. Indigenous peoples are not passive victims.
Absolutely not. They are resilient, resourceful, and determined to protect their lands, cultures, and futures.
They're leading the way in advocating for their rights, promoting sustainable development, and preserving the planet for future generations. Their voices and perspectives are absolutely essential as we grapple with global challenges.
Couldn't agree more. It's our responsibility to listen, learn, and support their efforts.
Now, this report has provided a glimpse into a complex and multifaceted issue. It doesn't offer easy answers,
It doesn't.
but it does illuminate the path forward.
Mm.
And it leaves us with this powerful question.
What can you do in your own life to contribute to a future where Indigenous people's rights are respected, their cultures thrive, and their voices shape the decisions that affect their lives?
We hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity, fueled your passion for justice, and given you a starting point for action.
Keep learning, keep engaging, and keep pushing for a world where Indigenous people's knowledge, wisdom, and resilience are not just recognized, but celebrated.
Thank you for joining us on this journey. Until next time, keep seeking knowledge, keep questioning, and keep striving for a better world for all, Aleva.